I call Kelvin Davis.
Mr Chair, and I'd just like to follow on, obviously, from Jacinda Ardern, who's raised some very good points about the purpose of this bill. That is, the purpose being to obtain information from returning offenders and establish release conditions for those offenders. There is nothing there about the rehabilitation and the reduction of reoffending. These people who are going to arrive on our doorstep within the coming days, they have no support conditions around them to help them get back on their feet, having been deported from their support systems, their family and friends, which, as Jacinda Ardern says, is one of the key elements of reducing reoffending and to help people to rehabilitate. But I just want to touch on the release conditions, and release conditions in the interpretation mean a standard release conditions or a special condition. I've pulled out the corrections information from their website there. It says standard conditions apply to all offenders and can include reporting regularly to community probation. Now, that sounds well and good for somebody who's been released from a New Zealand prison out into their community, near their family and friends. But what happens to these guys who have turned up, men and women, who have turned up in New Zealand, who have no connection to New Zealand, might arrive in Auckland, for example, but find that the best place for them, somewhere where they can try to find work or maybe establish themselves with a family member, is somewhere else around the country. And I take the example of Raymond, and I forget his last name again, sorry, who left New Zealand as a young child, lived all his life in Australia. He's 50-something now, but he originally came from somewhere near Dunedin. On his return to New Zealand, he's been returned and he's been put up by a compassionate couple up in Whangarei. Now, for now, Whangarei is where he's living, and he may have to report to a community probation officer in Whangarei, but the reality is he doesn't have a job in Whangarei and he's looking for work elsewhere. So he's going to be moving around the country to various places while he's looking for work, and it's going to be difficult for him to find where those community probation officers are in the various towns that he may have to move to in order to earn a living. So there's restrictions on living and working arrangements. Well, the biggest restriction for them is the fact that they don't have anywhere to live. They arrive in New Zealand, I'm told that they'll get a couple of $100 in their back pocket, and then 5 nights in a motel or hotel somewhere, and then they're on their own. Now, how on earth are their living arrangements going to be restricted when they have nowhere to live? Will they be banned from living in shop doorways in Lambton Quay or under bridges in Auckland? There's restrictions on associating with certain people. Look, these guys are going to turn up in New Zealand with no support networks around them, no family, no friends, nobody to turn to, and I've already said in the second reading, my concern is they're going to be just fodder for gang members who are going to see these guys who they know have been possibly in prison and detention centres, and that they will be ripe pickings for the killer bees, for the mongrel mob, the headhunters, without the support networks around them that are really necessary. Remember, this bill doesn't address, it addresses just the monitoring of parole conditions, or release conditions I should say. It doesn't address anything around supporting them in their social environment. So another standard condition is the limitations on the offender's ability to move to a new residential address. Well, that goes without saying that they are going to have difficulty moving to a new residential address. In fact, they're going to have difficulty moving to any address, let alone to a new residential address. Now, we understand that these conditions are there so that if they are a sex offender, they don't actually end up living next to a school or a park or a playground or an early childhood centre or somewhere where there are vulnerable people. We understand that, but it's one thing to have these standard release conditions for prisoners released from New Zealand prisons. It's another thing to have them for people who are coming back from Australia from detention centres or having been released from prison in Australia, Mr. Chair.
Kelvin Davis.
And I'd also just like to touch on again the interpretation, and again I spoke about this in the second reading, the definition of a returning offender and a returning prisoner. And the returning offender is a person who has been convicted in an overseas jurisdiction of an offence for conduct that constitutes an imprisonable offence in New Zealand, and being liable for deportation or removal as a result of that conviction has returned to New Zealand, and B includes a returning prisoner. The other one is the criteria for a person returning as a prisoner. I think it's meant to say, the wording and the heading on clause 17 is a bit weird. The Commissioner must determine that a person is a returning prisoner if the Commissioner is satisfied that the person has been convicted in an overseas jurisdiction of an offence for conduct that constitutes an imprisonable offence in New Zealand, and has in respect of that conviction been sentenced to 1, a term of imprisonment of more than 1 year, or 2, 2 or more terms of imprisonment that are cumulative. The reason I raise this is because you look at ko rutine, a guy who has not been charged, let alone imprisoned, let alone detained. Do conditions like this apply to a man like ko rutine who is detained in a detention centre or a prison in Australia without charges, and may in time be sent back to New Zealand? Does this, so the Minister's shaking her head, and so ko rutine will come back to New Zealand if he is deported, and he will just fit back into society. I mean, that's good to hear. It's good to hear. But the question is, why on earth is he locked up in Australia in the first place? And our government is doing nothing to address that. Maybe they have information that we don't know, but it just seems really strange on face value that a guy who laid down his life for the who was there to protect the Prime Minister in Afghanistan, would have laid down his life if he had to, and yet the Prime Minister won't get off his feet in order to assist that gentleman. So, Mr. Chair, as we go through this bill, no doubt there's going to be a number of issues that we raise. There's again the whole speed of this process has meant that there are, I believe, drafting errors. Again, I'll just return to the heading of clause 7. It says who is returning offender. Doesn't quite make sense to me. The heading for clause 17, criteria for determination that person is returning prisoner. Again, the school teacher in me, or the old school teacher in me, is slightly offended by the grammar. Maybe I'm just missing something in my naivety, but as we go through, I'm sure that more errors will emerge, and it's just an example of why it's necessary to take our time in drafting legislation and not rushing it through as this has been done in the 12 days, I believe, because we have known that this situation has been on the cards for the last 12 months. Kia ora.
I call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.